and welcome back to Simplified Human Physiology for 9th and 10th grades. Today we have Module 5, which is the River of Life, Blood. This is Dave, your teacher, and I will be with you for the next 20 to 30 minutes while we take a look at that very interesting fluid in our body, blood. First thing we're going to take a look at is where is this blood anyway? Well, as you can see, these are the major arteries in the body. That's where the blood is contained, in the arteries. Think of them as tubes carrying blood. And the reason they're called arteries is they all leave the heart and go out to the body cells in all directions. If it's leaving the heart and going out, it would be oxygen rich. So this supply of blood obviously is taking oxygen out to the body cells. Now, once the blood goes out from the heart in the arteries, the blood has to return, and it returns through the veins. So these gives you an idea of the veins in the body here. And obviously, since the blood has been out to the body cells, it has dropped off a lot of the CO2 and dropped off oxygen and picked up CO2, and it's on its way back to the heart, and then it will be delivered out to the lungs to pick up more oxygen, right? Of course. I was going to say, the blood is not evenly distributed throughout the arteries and the veins, which I'll talk about later. But about 2/3 of the blood is contained in the veins, and about 1/3 of the remaining blood is found in the arteries, okay? But again, 100% of all the blood is found in the blood vessels and nowhere else. Okay, so that's it as far as this picture. So how much are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about 5 liters of blood in the average adult person. That would be the same as 5,000 milliliters. So here we're using our metrics again. Now, if you want to think in the English system, it would be about 1 1/4 gallons of blood in an adult person. Okay, quite a bit. Now, let's do something interesting here and take a look at the blood. We're going to take some of the blood out of your body right here. Not very much, just enough to fill a test tube. And there's the test tube of blood, so it's not very much. And the next thing we're going to do is take that test tube of blood and we're going to put it in a machine right here that spins around very, very fast. And as it spins around, all of the heavy part of the blood will go down to the bottom of the test tube, and the lighter part of the blood will stay up at the top of the test tube, all right? And when we're finished with this spinning around, this is what we see in the test tube, that much of the bottom part of the test tube is filled with a red substance, and above that is kind of a light yellow substance, and then of course that's all. So the blood is divided into these 2 substances here. Let's take a closer look and see what the test tube would show. Okay, so here's a picture of the same test tube that we just spun around. And as you can see, in the bottom of the test tube, we have what we call red blood cells. They're fairly heavy, and that's why the spinning sent them down to the bottom of the test tube by gravity. At the top of the test tube, we see kind of a pale yellow liquid. We're going to call this plasma. I'll show you the spelling in a minute. It's just a clear, watery liquid that the blood cells are in. And then there's an interesting, tiny little layer right here between these two that is kind of a white layer. And these are the white blood cells that we're going to take a look at shortly also. All right. So if we take a look at the parts of blood, we're going to start out with this word plasma because that is the watery part of the blood. And that composed a little bit more than half, about 55% of the blood is this watery plasma. Okay. Now, what is in the plasma? Well, let's take a look. First of all, we have red blood cells, which we're going to abbreviate RBC. We also have white blood cells, abbreviated WBC, and something called platelets. These are kind of the cells that we're going to find in the bloodstream. But then there's also materials that are in the blood. And let's take a look at what those materials are. Obviously, there's two gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Minerals are floating around in the bloodstream. This would include things like sodium and magnesium and potassium and calcium, for example. There's also the vitamins that actually come from the plants that we eat. Vitamin A, B, C, D, and so on, all the various vitamins, again, floating around in the plasma. There's also hormones, for example, estrogen, adrenaline, insulin, testosterone. Those are all hormones, and they would also be floating around in the bloodstream, depending on what's happening with the person. We also have something called antibodies. Now, when you get a vaccine, you're introducing a little bit of disease into a person, and the person responds by making antibodies. These are like little soldiers that fight against germs, and we'll talk more about those later, but they'll be floating around in the bloodstream also. And finally, something called urea, which contains nitrogen. This is the breakdown of proteins, and urea, of course, will enter our urine to be urinated out, and this is one of the waste products of cells that we need to get rid of. So here is kind of a total picture of everything in the blood, three kinds of blood cells, and then these various substances floating around in the plasma. Okay? Let's take a closer look at the red blood cells. Okay. The red blood cells, first of all, carry oxygen, and if we did not have red blood cells, we would not be able to carry as much oxygen. The red blood cells allow us to carry 60 times more oxygen than if the oxygen was just dissolved in the plasma. So the red blood cells is a big, big deal. And of course, these are going out to the body cells. But surprisingly, the red blood cells also carry CO2 in the other direction, from the cells back to the lungs. The red blood cells have iron inside, which helps them to hold on to the oxygen. And this is what gives the red blood cells their color. Fe is the chemical symbol for iron. Now, let's take a look at white blood cells. What do they do? Well, they find and actually eat or gobble up germs. So we're very thankful we have those in our bloodstream. They also clean up debris. any kind of leftover parts, broken parts, uh, things that need to be kind of cleaned up and taken away. They're sort of scavengers in that regard. They also produce antibodies, which we spoke about before, little soldiers that fight against disease. And unlike the red cells, the white cells can actually move around on their own. They can actually leave the blood vessel and go into the tissue spaces where the cells are in pursuit of germs. Red cells simply move along with the bloodstream passively, but the white cells can be actively pursue germs and gobble them up. Finally, in the cell division, we've got something called platelets. And these are very important if you're bleeding. If you have a cut and you're bleeding either inside or outside, the platelets will form a clot and stop you from bleeding. All right? And a little bit later, here it is. This gives you an idea of the platelets in action. There has been a cut on the skin, and the platelets have helped to put together these strands of kind of sticky substance, and these are red cells that have been caught in the sticky substance, and they help to form, this is a clot that is forming. All right, so this shows you kind of platelets in action. Let's take a closer look at what the red cells actually look like. They've been called donut-shaped, and that's a very good description. They're microscopic, and we're going to talk about the size in a minute or so. They're quite numerous. In fact, red cells take up about 70% of all the cells in the body. So very, very numerous. They have this shape because it helps to improve their surface area to carry oxygen and CO2. Let's take a look at white cells, see what they look like. And we can see at the top here, these are actual photographs of white cells, kind of fluffy looking things. Down at the bottom, these are also white cells. There's 5 different kinds of white cells, and we're not going to go into depth on the differences, but if you take a more advanced course, you can find out more about all the different kinds of white cells. But remember, their main function is to fight disease, fight germs that get inside your body. Over on the right side, we see an artist's conception of what we're looking at. Okay. And we also have a picture of a platelet. Now this is a red blood cell here, and this is a platelet right next to it. So you can see it's very small, about 1/3 to 1/4 the size of a red blood cell. And remember, the platelets don't do anything unless there's bleeding. Then they'll rush to the bleeding site and they'll help to form a clot. On this other side here, we see a couple of platelets that are sticking together as part of their job in forming a clot. Now, to summarize what we've been looking at, here are the red blood cells, here are the platelets, and here are the 5 kinds of white blood cells, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The reason they have a color inside of them is that normally they're fairly clear, and the microscope person has to add a little dye or a color in order to see them better. Okay, so again, red cells, platelets, and 5 kinds of white cells. Okay. We're going to be talking about the blood cells a little bit more, but especially their size. And when we talk about their size, I need to introduce a new metric unit to you here. All right. You remember in the module on the metric system, we talked about the millimeter. The millimeter being there were 10 millimeters to a centimeter, right? So it's pretty small. In fact, I would say that a millimeter is about the size of that pencil tip right there. Very, very tiny, okay? So when we talk about microscopic things, we're talking about 1,000th of a millimeter, all right? And 1,000th of a millimeter, we have a new unit called a micron, okay? Sometimes called a micrometer by scientists these days, but in the old days it was called micron, and I still think that's used quite a bit. So a micron, 1,000 microns equals a millimeter. You can see how tiny they are. Now, what's this little symbol over here? This is the Greek letter mu, and the Greek letter mu is used to be 1 micron. So if I say 1 mu, I'm really talking about 1 micron, and that's the distance. That's how the length of something, okay? And when we talk about cells, we're talking about the diameter of a cell, okay? The only other thing that we're going to look at here is something we already kind of know about, and that is sometimes we use K to mean a kilo, like a kilogram would be 1,000 grams. So just the K by itself sometimes means 1,000. So I might be referring to that when I talk about blood cells. Okay, now, with that in mind, I'd like to introduce this table, which I think will explain quite a few things. I know it's a lot of information, but I put it in a table, and I certainly don't expect you to remember this right away. Over here on the left side, we can see that we're talking about how many of these red, white cells and platelets are found in a cubic millimeter of blood. That's what this means. How many cells in a cubic millimeter of blood? Down below that, we have the size and diameter of these cells, and then we have the lifespan. Well, how long do they last in the body? Okay? Let's take a first look at the first one here. We see that red blood cells, for every cubic millimeter of red blood cells, there are 5 million RBCs. That's a lot. If we look at their size, they're 7 microns in diameter. Okay? And if we look at their lifespan, they last about 3 to 4 weeks. Now let's look at white cells in the same categories. Every cubic millimeter of white cells, there are about 8,000. Okay? Their size is about 14 microns across, about double what you would see in red blood cells, and they last about 2 to 3 weeks before they die or are destroyed. Platelets is the last of the things of the blood cells, and again, in a cubic millimeter of blood, we'll find 400,000 platelets. Their size is about 3 microns in diameter, so about maybe half the size of red blood cells, and they last 7 to 10 days. Very, very short lifespan. So again, this table gives you a sense of how many cells there are in the blood, what their size is in diameter, and how long they live. Okay, good. By the way, I got one more picture about the action of the platelets forming the sticky strands to stop the bleeding and start a clot. Very, very important. Okay. Now the question becomes, where does the blood cells come from? Well, that's pretty easy. And here's the answer. They come from the large bones in our body, in the marrow, the inside marrow of the bones. The bones can be the leg, the thigh bones from the legs, or they can be the arm bones from the arms. In either case, inside the bones is where the red cells, the white cells, and the platelets are all produced, and then they enter the bloodstream. Now the next question is, well, what happens to these blood cells when they've finished their job? And I've got an answer for you on that also. All right. This picture by now should be pretty familiar to you. We've got the heart right here. We've got the lungs here and here. We've got the stomach right here. We've got the large intestines going across this way. We've got the small intestines here. Now, I want you to bring your attention right over here to this organ right there. See it on the left side of the stomach? That's called the spleen. And the spleen is where the red and white cells go to die, especially the red cells. Okay? And I've got a picture of the spleen right here. It's about 5 inches long and about 3 inches across. To give you an idea, it's a fairly small organ. All right, so now that we've seen the picture of the spleen, let's look at some of the functions of the spleen, and we'll take a look right here. First, the spleen removes old red blood cells. Remember, the red blood cells only last about 3 to 4 weeks, and then they're either die or they're destroyed, and much of that destruction happens in the spleen. Okay. Also, the spleen holds red blood cells in reserve, even up to about 250 milliliters worth. And when there's a need for additional red blood cells, for example, if there's bleeding or whatever, then more blood cells will be dumped into the circulation by the spleen. Also, as iron is a very important part of the red blood cell, that was the part that connects with the oxygen, the spleen is able to recycle the iron, so it's not peed out or in other ways lost. It's recycled. And again, Fe is the chemical symbol for iron. Okay. And finally, among the things the spleen can do is house white blood cells, or WBCs. And in times of need, like if you have an infection and more white blood cells are needed, the spleen can dump extra white blood cells into the circulation. So the spleen is a very interesting organ, that's for sure. Okay. Okay. Now, how many of you know what your blood type is? Okay. Mine happens to be O positive. All right. How many of you know how many blood types there are? Okay, well, there are 4, and we're going to take a look at them right now. We're also going to take a look at not only what the types are, but why you can only transfuse or receive other types of blood and not some types of blood. All right? Let's take a look. We're going to start with, cover this up for a minute. This person, this is a red cell taken from a person who has type A blood. It says so right there, okay? Now, how do we know this person has type A blood? Because on the surface of the red cells, they have this, let's call it the A factor, okay? If a person has A factors on the surface of their blood cells, they have type A. Now, what about type B? This person over here has type B blood, and the reason is on the surface of his or her red cells is the type B factor. Simple as that. You either have type A blood or you have type B blood. How can it be more simple than that? Well, down here, as you can see, this person has type AB blood. And if you look at the surface of their red cells, they have both the A and the B factor on the surface. See them? This person has type A blood, AB. And the fourth kind of blood has none of the A or B factors on the surface, and we call this person type O. Okay? Now, what is it? Why is it that some people can receive certain blood types but not others? Okay? And I'm going to go try to explain that. It's fairly simple. Okay? The golden rule is this. Type A blood doesn't like B blood, and type B blood doesn't like A blood. If you remember that, you'll always get this right, okay? Now, the person who has type A blood here, in the plasma, remember the watery part of the blood, this person has anti-B particles, and the anti-B particles hate B blood. So if B blood comes into an A person, guess what's going to happen? The anti-B particles are going to attack the B blood and make it clump into little groups. And when the blood clumps, it can't get through the small blood vessels. Okay? The opposite can also happen. If we take type A person and try to put it into B person blood, the anti-A particles in this person's blood will attack the A blood. So you see why the A and the B's do not get along at all, okay? Now A can receive A and B can receive B, but A cannot receive B and B cannot receive A. Simple as that. Let's go to these other ones, the third kind of blood cell, type AB. A person who has type AB blood has both the AB factors on the surface, but has none of the antiparticles. So this guy can receive A and B blood very, very fine, no problem, because there's no antiparticles to attack it. Okay? This person is usually called the universal recipient. They can receive any blood. Okay? And let's look at the last one over here, type O blood. Okay? Type O blood has neither factor on the surface of the red blood cells, but has both anti-A and anti-B particles. So if an A person tries to give to this guy, what's going to happen? The anti-A particles will attack it. What if a B type person tries to give to this guy? Then the anti-B particles will attack it also. So O is a good person to donate blood, but not a good person to receive blood, because the O person's both anti-particles will attack any blood coming in, except another O. Okay? So that's the basics of blood typing, and it's just doctors have to be very familiar with this so they don't donate or transfuse the wrong kinds of blood. Now, there's another factor involved that researchers learned about in the 1940s, and this is something called the Rh factor. Maybe you've heard that some people have blood type A positive or A negative or B positive or B negative or O positive, whatever. They have one of these signs, either positive or negative. Well, this is something called the Rh factor, and it comes about by research that was done on rhesus monkeys, like I said, in the 1940s. You can see the Rh in the word rhesus for rhesus monkeys. The Rh factor was a factor like the A and the B factor on the surface of the red blood cells, And it turned out that, oh, and by the way, about 85% of the Caucasian population is positive, has the positive factor, and about 93% of the African Americans have the positive factor. All right, that gives you an idea of the distribution. Now, the only thing here is that you don't want a positive giving blood in a transfusion to a negative person, because the negative person will see the positive uh, as a germ, as an invader, and that person's blood will attack it and cause the blood to clump. So this is another reason that we don't want to mix up the positives and the negative. The negatives can give to negatives, the positives can give the positives, but the positive Rh factor cannot give to a negative Rh factor person in a transfusion. Okay? Now, there's another interesting thing that happens with the Rh factor, and that's when there is a pregnancy involved. And I'm going to show you here what happens in that situation. Here we have a dad and a mom, and the mom is pregnant. There's the baby right there. Okay. Now, if both the father and the mother are Rh negative, then there's no problem because the baby cannot inherit a trait that's not there, right? So the baby automatically is going to be negative also. All three negatives, no problem. But what if this happens? What if the mother is Rh negative, but the father is Rh positive, and the baby has inherited the father's positive trait? Then the baby will be a positive inside a negative person. What happens is the mother's blood will regard the baby as an invader, as like a germ. And the mother's blood, actually her antibodies, will attack the baby's blood and cause it to clump. This could even kill the baby. So this is definitely a negative Rh reaction that can happen when the father is positive and the mother is negative. Fortunately, doctors can find out ahead of time who has the Rh factor, and if the situation happens that the baby could carry the positive factor, then the mother can be given a special medicine which suppresses that antibody reaction, and the mother will be okay. By the way, this reaction, if there is a reaction against the baby, it usually happens on the second and third pregnancy. The first pregnancy, the mother will develop the antibodies, but not quick enough to attack the baby. On a second and third pregnancy is where the danger comes, because now the antibodies are present in the mother and can attack the baby much more quickly. So anyway, this is how the Rh factor can affect the blood typing. Here's another interesting thing concerning blood, and that is giving a donation, going down to your blood bank and offering to give some of your blood to help people who are in trouble and need blood. Here's what happens. You walk in, they ask you a whole bunch of questions to qualify you, but assuming that you can give blood all right, you are going to give around 500 ml, or about half a liter of blood. This is 1/10 of your 5 liters, so it's not a big deal. They don't want to take any more than that, but 1/10 is okay. So that's how much you're going to give. When you're finished giving, which only takes about between 5 and 10 minutes, they will sit you down. They don't want to let you run out the door, but they will sit you down and they will give you some juice or water to drink because they want you to do that. You, in giving this 500 milliliters of blood, your blood pressure now is lower than it was before. And if you get up too quickly or try to run, you may faint. So what the people at the donation center want you to do is drink 300 to 400 milliliters of water or juice, not to replace your RBCs, that will take longer, but to boost your blood pressure back up so that you have blood going to your brain as you leave the center. The actual replacement of the red blood cells that you have given up here takes about 3 to 4 weeks. So during this time, you should not, run the marathon or do anything that takes a lot of strenuous activity, because you are down about 1/10 of your ability, and you should kind of take it easy until your body has replaced those red blood cells. Okay? All right. We're going to get into something interesting, and there's something new that I have to show you that's similar to diffusion, but a little bit different. You recall that diffusion is a way that the body has of spreading everything out. For example, let's say you take a pill for a headache, aspirin or something like that, and it goes down in your stomach and into your bloodstream. What that aspirin does is spread out evenly throughout your body. It doesn't just stay in one place. And everything that you take in does the same thing. It spreads out. This is called diffusion. And as we talked about before, diffusion always happens this way. If you have a partition here, like a cell membrane or other partition, and you have very crowded particles on one side and not crowded particles on the other side, which way are the particles going to move in order to spread out? They're obviously going to go this way, to the right, in order to have more particles over here, have an even number of particles on both sides, right? Okay, but I have a question for you. In some places of the body, this partition here doesn't allow these particles to go over here. What's going to happen now? How do we spread things out? Well, there is a way that happens, and that way is that instead of particles going from this side over to here, water will pass from this side over to this side to spread these particles out. Okay? In other words, if these particles can't go over there, water from there will go over here, and the effort will spread these particles out to be evenly spread out as they. And this is called osmosis. I know it's a funny word, but this is very, very common in the human body, that water will move to certain locations in order to spread things out. Osmosis. And I'm going to go into actually a possible way that someone could die from this osmosis. Now, here we see a good example of particles in the body spreading out. Now, these particles happen to be in a watery environment, which most of the body is. And these, let me cover this up. These are salt particles, because obviously our body is full of salt. But like other particles, these salt particles have spread out. This is a body cell, and you can see it has some salt particles inside. And there is some also salt particles in the fluid or in the water surrounding the body cell. You notice that the salt particles are evenly spread out, not only outside, but inside the cell. This is kind of an equilibrium which the body tries to achieve. Now, the body itself has a salt content of a little less than 1% salt, 0.9% salt, and it's very important that this amount is kept at all times. So if there's extra salt in the body, you'll pee it out. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you a situation that's very interesting, and that is that you are one day out in a boat in the ocean, and the boat sinks, and you jump in a life raft, but you forget to take any fresh water with you. So now many days have gone by and you have no water to drink, no fresh water, but you're looking at all the oceans surrounding you and you're thinking, oh my God, I was so thirsty. And you start to drink the seawater. What can be the problem? Well, the problem is that seawater is 3.5% salt, about 4 times saltier than our body fluids. And if you start to drink this salt from the ocean, what's going to happen? That's the question. Well, this is what's going to happen. That seawater is going to enter their bloodstream with all the salt, and pretty soon all of their body cells will be surrounded by crowded salt particles, right? Compared to the fewer salt particles that are inside the cell. What's going to happen so that the salt particles can be spread out evenly? Well, water from inside the cell is going to be pulled out into the outside fluid like that. And as water is pulled out in order to spread these by osmosis, what's going to happen to the body cell? It's going to shrink down and it's going to die. And if this happens in your brain, then this is what it looks like when it has shrunken down and died. All right? This is why people who are, in the ocean and decide to drink ocean water dehydrate. They dehydrate their brain cells and end up dying. You should never, never drink seawater in hopes that you're going to survive. The last thing we're going to take a look at today is one of the diseases that can happen from the blood, and this is called sickle cell anemia. This happens to a great extent in African Americans, and these are normal blood cells, but what we see here is a blood cell in the shape of a sickle. A sickle is a tool that you use to cut wheat in the field, and any kind of red blood cell that looks like this cannot carry oxygen and cannot do its work. So African Americans who have a large number of these sickle cells have a lot of problems in transporting oxygen to the various tissues. So with that, I think we're going to bring our module to an end. I hope you've enjoyed this module on the blood. And our next module, Module 6, we're going into the heart and see how the heart works. So this is Dave, and I'll see you with our next module, and goodbye.